Well, I think we should get started, and then as other people arrive, they can jump on in. So welcome everyone to our wonderful Art Meets Science conversation this evening. Looking forward to this. You're in for a real treat. My name is Cynthia Cutting. I'm the director of the Museum of the White Mountains. I'm very proud to be presenting this conversation this evening, and also proud that the museum is hosting such an amazing, innovative, creative, and beautiful exhibition that is presented because of our three speakers this evening. So we're really, really proud to be presenting it. And so I know that you'll be able to see some of those images and parts of the exhibit this evening and subsequently. So I'm really glad to be sharing it with you. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our three speakers, and they're just going to give us a couple of introductory comments, and then we'll be moving into a pre-recorded recording, and then we're going to be having some question and answer at the end. If you have questions throughout the evening, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll be checking those, and Rebecca will be raising those questions to our speakers at the end. Rebecca is also going to be putting the link to the exhibition in the chat. So if you'd like to click on that and look at the beautiful images while our speakers are speaking, you are perfectly welcome to do that. Our three speakers this evening, Kimberly Ritchie, Hannah Vollmer, and Diana Jolles are here. And I would just like each of you to just give a quick introduction of yourselves before we get started. So Kimberly, would you start?
Hi, I'm Kimberly Ritchie. I am the printmaking coordinator and teach within the studio art program at PSU. And my artwork as part of this exhibit was created on a sabbatical that I had from PSU. I was able to visit both Greece and Iceland through a grant, and the work is based around environmental issues related to these cultures, but also work that was created that's relevant to what's happening here in New England.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Diana, could you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I am a professor of plant science or botany in the biology department at PSU. I teach courses in everything from general biology to general botany and advanced botany topics. My degrees are in evolutionary biology and botany, and I've been interested in plants since I was somewhat of a reluctant scholar, but have always been hooked on plants. In this exhibit, we're featuring the Plymouth State University Herbarium, which was somewhat buried for many years, but has a very rich collection of the New England flora, including 75% of all the species that occur in New England, in addition to a huge collection, probably more than half the collection is of marine algae. And if you look at the exhibition online, you'll see these gorgeous seaweeds that were contributed by the late Dick Freilich, who was a professor of botany before me. So really lucky to have this extremely valuable collection, and happy to share it with you guys and with Kimberly's lovely prints.
Thank you, Diana.
Yeah.
Hannah, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Hannah Vollmer. I'm a graduate student in biology here at PSU. My background is in conservation ecology and natural history, but I'm focusing on alpine plants for my thesis research. I'm looking at the genetic diversity of a very rare alpine plant called dwarf cinquefoil. It only grows in New Hampshire. So that's what I'm focusing on right now.
Thank you, Hannah. So now that you know our speakers here, you'll see we'll be able to ask them live questions about their comments that from this conversation that we had just last week, and I know that you'll enjoy it. I think, yeah, you'll find it's really good. So I'm sure you'll come up with lots of questions. I already have a few of my own to share later on. So now Rebecca will press play and we will enjoy this conversation.
All right, bear with me 1 second while I get this set up. Okay.
Awesome.
So let's get started with our conversation. So can you each talk about, it's so interesting to me that all of you share some common ideas in your practices, some actual tasks, actions, activities that are, though they might have different lenses, they're very similar. I think of, in particular, the idea of collecting and observing nature. So can you guys talk about that?
Sure, I can start. So in my work at PSU, I'm working with the genetics of these rare alpine plants. So it requires this very strong intentionality on what plants and what species I'll be collecting. So it requires getting permits and permissions to go into special protected areas. So I have to think about well ahead of time, having a plan of what I'm collecting, how much, making sure I'm following the protocols that were set out for me, and then having this respect as you approach this alpine zone and the plants when choosing which ones to sample, to not sample so much that it's impacting the population or the species. So just taking small pieces of the plants, enough to do my research, but no more than that. So it's just this strong intentionality of taking what I need and no more, and not impacting anything.
Yeah, that's great, Hannah. And then you collect, and then what do you do with those specimens?
So those will get preserved with silica gel. So it's a dehydrating substance. So you're just making these dried samples and then bringing them into the lab to store properly until you're going to use them, and then extracting DNA to be able to run some genetic tests on them and see about how they're related to each other, what kind of diversity there is in the population. And then I'm also sampling from herbarium collections. And so that involves taking these plants that were already collected prior, so maybe even 100 years ago, and then being very intentional about which leaves I am removing from that. They're going to be permanently destroyed, these small pieces of those plants. So again, I don't want to impact the overall specimen and just take what's needed.
That's great. And mentioning the herbarium, Diana, do you want to jump in here about your practice?
Sure. So herbaria are museums for preserved plants, and they serve as a physical documentation of a plant that was collected at a specific location and a specific time. Like I said, herbaria are very old. People have been keeping them for hundreds of years. And the idea is to have this sort of connection to both the past and the future by keeping these specimens. They are used for a variety of purposes to better understand the appearance of plants, and the preserved specimens actually contain a lot of information, not just, like Hannah said, they contain DNA, but they also contain lots of micromorphological features, little morphological features that you can see with a microscope, or more larger features that are quite beautiful, that help us understand the connectedness of all living things and how different shapes and forms evolved. So when you're in an herbarium, what's so amazing is to see the diversity of form sort of on these pages and think about function and diversity.
So a lot of our work involves understanding the biology of plants and making these preserved specimens that people can look at 100, 200 years from now if they want to know what plants were like in the past and where they grew in the past and things like that. So these specimens are collected from the field by people like Hannah or myself. Anyone can. In fact, this is quite a craft at one point to make little personal herbaria of pressed plants that would document the flora around your own property. Plants are pressed flat, they're dried, and then usually mounted on acid-free paper with a little label that contains a lot of information about when it was collected, where it was collected, some of the conditions in the surrounding area. So like Hannah was saying, it involves a lot of careful observation. And when you read the labels, you can really see how passionate people are about these keen observations. That's one of the links, I think, that this type of natural history study has with art, in that it does not just require keen observational skills, there's like a real joy in it, you know, of seeing like everything from minute characteristics to these larger features that are just fun to enjoy, especially all together, which you can see on display in the exhibit.
Yeah, and those minute characteristics to us in artistic terms are amazingly beautifully, naturally designed objects. So yes, we definitely see that connection, which leads us very beautifully into Kimberly. Can you talk about collecting and specimens in your terms? How does that work?
Yeah, what Hannah and Diana have mentioned is exactly what I was going to build off of with observation and collecting just through an artistic lens. And I'm completely inspired by the scientist approach to their collection, and many times bring that into my own work as an artist, almost replicating their approach to observation and collecting. But specifically in this work at the museum, the specimens that I was collecting happened from looking at everyday objects when I was in my artist residency in Greece. And that was walking to the small rocky beach every day and collecting sea plastic. So the norm is to collect, you know, historically sea glass, to find these treasured pieces of sea glass that have been mulled over in the sand for 60 plus years. And now that's changed, and it's based around plastic at this point. So I really became inspired by the collection of the sea plastic as part of this work in particular. But my students, when we worked with the endangered plant species, looked quite a bit into not collecting them, because we did not take that approach to finding them and collecting them through the science lens, but definitely researching and observing those when we created the artwork in that class.
Yeah, that idea of collecting information and also referring to, I'm sure your students spent time really thinking about the forms and the individual images and the kinds of things that represent those plants, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's so cool. I love that.
And
Sorry, go ahead, Hannah.
I see a link between the art and the science here, because you're collecting a subset of something to represent something larger in the world. You know, you can't just take the whole beach home with you and put it on display. You have to choose what is it that's going to best represent this scene or this feeling or this process. And so that's what collecting plants is too, is to get something representative of the habitat or of the species, the place and the time, without, you know, taking the whole population.
That's a great connection and a great point to make.
Right, and I like what you said about that, Hannah, because it leads to me into this idea of creating categories as you're collecting and sorting, which was actually part of our initial discussion about this exhibition. Was we have this whole world of plants and ecosystems to talk about. What are the categories that are important to us? And Kimberly, can you talk about the first words that you brought up? And then Diana, if you could jump in.
Sure.
Great. Go ahead.
So when I was working on this body of work for the past few years, it really started off with the student work when we started working with the Endangered Animal Species Project. And that, of course, fueled my own work and back and forth, being inspired by my students and what they do, and have that content coming into the classroom, and then that fueling the inspiration for my work. So we started off with the endangered species, and that evolved into invasive species, and thinking broadly about what invasive species are. And I said in this work that I'm considering us humans as the invasive species, just like the sea plastic ending up in the ocean. And then the Undiscovered gave me a chance to explore as an artist and not feel tied down to those two specific terms, but also imagining what is undiscovered in our world that we don't know about. We do not know it all as humans. There's so much to the natural world that is unknown that we have yet to discover and or figure out about how systems work. So that the Undiscovered term was playing off of that as well.
And so Diana, those terms, the endangered and invasive and undiscovered, can you talk about how those felt as a scientist?
Sure. I felt two different things. The first thing that comes to mind is that these terms actually, some of them, endangered and invasive, have technical definitions that are based on human perception. So there's a value underlying the definition of endangered and the technical definition of invasive. And they're sort of boring. Endangered refers to the fact that a species may have a very restricted geographic range and may have very few populations and very few individuals within those populations. It's also sometimes defined by having some kind of peril. So like maybe their habitat is being encroached on, and so they're endangered for that reason. Invasive plants, that's another. So, well, as you can imagine, if our definition of species changes, or our concept of a species, so maybe the species evolves or hybridizes with another species over the course of time and change through evolution, our ideas about management should also change. So endangered is something that should be in flux, and it really represents sort of the snapshot in time. Invasive is similar as well. In science, we like to think about the idea that all species that have a broad range must have been invasive at one point to sort of get a foothold in a new ecosystem. But nowadays we think of invasive as a species that can outcompete other species in a new environment and sort of take over. And I think around New Hampshire, we have examples of invasive species that produce a monoculture in an environment. So they come in and they're very successful, which should be a positive thing, but they're so successful that they actually convert the habitat to one that has less complexity. And so the result of that, ecological models suggest, is that those habitats that are less complex and have fewer species also can provide fewer sort of functions in terms of like cleaning water, cleaning air, all of these complex ecosystem interactions that happen between organisms and their environment decrease when you decrease the number of species in an environment. And so invasive species are sort of like this threat to that complexity. And so that's sort of the technical aspect of it. The non-technical aspect is that, yes, these things are in flux all the time, and they're really based on human perception and our current system of values. So when we say biodiversity is good, you know, it can mean a couple different things. To some people, it means we would like to keep this diverse ecosystem as it is. And there's sort of the suggestion of stasis there, but we know this is impossible, right? All things evolve and change. And so thinking about endangered and invasive species from multiple perspectives, I think is really, really cool. And the part that I think both Hannah and I love about sort of the artistic point of view, thinking about endangered and invasive, is that since there are, science usually informs policy, and that policy is meant to inform management practices. So this is like a very utilitarian reason for having these definitions that are sort of decided upon as a group, by a group. And through art, we have this opportunity to talk about endangerment or invasiveness in ways that are really decided by the individual artist, and are more sort of emotionally accessible to more people. So while you may have people who disagree with policy, probably not going to disagree with in the same way an artist's interpretation of invasions, right? Or an endangered species, which really speak more to the human condition and are more, not easier to understand, it's just accessible, compelling in a different way than, say, environmental law.
Mm-hmm. And those two terms, endangered and invasive, have really heavy human meanings. Like, the reason we use those terms are because many of the plants that say we might want to conserve and that are endangered might be that way because of some sort of human impact. Mm-hmm. And many invasives we call invasive because it was because of human impact, maybe development or global trade. Otherwise, would we even use those terms? But by labeling them as such, you're sort of acknowledging, like, there's a human aspect to this, and maybe we should be managing it or doing something about it. The same way that art can make you think about things in a certain way by how it's presented.
I love that term labeling that you use there, because I think that in both art and science, there's information that's not only observational, it's actually sometimes has underlying motivations and messages and ideas that you want to put forward. Reflecting on this work, what do you want to have happen? So can you all talk about your exactly those intentions, your personal intentions through your work? I think that would be awesome. Yeah, Kimberly, you ready to say that?
Yeah, I will start.
Okay.
Anytime I want to start with a little bit of a personal reflection, because anytime I make work, I don't necessarily have the end audience in mind. I'm perhaps most of the time making it initially in my own reaction. So I don't have an end goal that I think what a piece of work is going to look like. I'm inspired as I go along, like when I visit new places. Especially on my artist residencies, when I get to spend time in a place and learn about the culture and the environmental impacts that are happening in that specific region. So I'm inspired by that at the beginning, and then the work will evolve. So in this exhibition, my personal interest came out of just that. So visiting Greece and Iceland and working and listening to people in those particular towns talk about the environmental impacts that are happening in those areas, working with my students and listening to them talk about the research they've done with endangered New England plant species and the global animal species. And that just evolved out of the initial research and discussions that were happening that I was inspired by with my students.
That's great. That's great. Diana, when you're working, what do you hope will happen when you're working, and organizing and collecting and presenting your work? What are your hopes?
Yeah. The specimens that we collect really support the scientific research that we're doing. We know that they'll last forever, but they are, like I said, they're physical documentation, and so they really serve sort of the support function for the other research that we do. So I'll collect data on the plants and present information to scientific audiences about how specific traits have evolved, how things look, how geographic ranges have changed over time, things like that. The specimens can be revisited by scientists anytime. So I think the careful observation that we can do with specimens and making sure that scientists and students have something that they can work with and learn from way into the future, and also teaching them how to sort of respect the past. Preservation methods are really important, and I find that students working with specimens get a lot out of cataloging them, understanding these groups of species, whether they're rare or common or invasive, where they grow, how they grow. All of this information can be learned from the grunt work of filing herbarium specimens or making repairs to them. So, I think students, that's sort of part of the practice. When you're a curator of specimens, you intimately know your specimens. And so the students who have worked in the Plymouth State University Herbarium learn all the taxonomic names. They learn a lot about history, old collectors from New England and the organizations they belong to, how different places have changed over time. So we have many amazing specimens that were collected from the Manchester area, which, as you know, is a bustling city now. Those specimens were collected when there were forests in Manchester. So it's kind of neat to be able to see this history of change across the landscape through the lens of plants, which is pretty cool. So I hope that the specimens convey sort of this appreciation for history and sort of this continuum going into the future, that we value these species, respect them. And it's reminding me, I was telling Hannah earlier, it was reminding me of when I was an undergraduate in college and started really getting interested in herbaria. I thought of the preservation of plants as sort of like a mortician. You're like, really trying to render the plant in this preserved form in a way that says something about what it was like when it was alive,
Totally. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I guess in a way, that's exactly what I'm doing with my work as well, trying to capture that.
Yeah, like that capturing a moment is so important, right? And that people can learn from your intense observation. I think that's so important. Hannah, you've worked with a particular plant and its plight. Can you talk a little bit about what can happen?
Yeah, so the dwarf cinquefoil has been it's a very studied plant. There's a lot that we know about this plant. It only grows in New Hampshire in the White Mountains in a few places. And it's been, people have been interested in it since the 1830s when Europeans were checking out the alpine zones and seeing all these new plants that they had never seen before. And so a lot of these plants were very heavily collected because so many botanists just wanted to come and see them. It's not like they could just take photos and send them to their pals. They had to take collections and mail them. So we have a lot of collections of this plant. And so I'll be looking at it in new ways that they would have never thought of at that time. So taking some of those samples and looking at the genetics, and it's cool to be able to go back to these herbarium specimens and get a snapshot of that time to see if things were different then, if the genetics were a little bit different than they are today, or if they're all about the same and things haven't changed. So many were collected that it took a pretty big bite out of the population. So I'm hoping that my work will help inform some conservation and management of this plant, and it's already pretty heavily managed. The area that it's in is protected. Trails have been eliminated from the area, rerouted. A lot of education around this plant goes to hikers, but we don't know for sure how it reproduces. It has a specific way of creating its own seeds that are viable, but not with fertilization. So it's like an asexual plant that just makes seeds that grow. And that's not uncommon in the plant world, but It could have some management implications if that's not the case, because it's been so managed and seeds taken from populations to be planted elsewhere to expand the populations, but so we don't really know what we're doing with the genetics when we're moving the plants around. So I'm hoping to see what the diversity is in these populations, if there is any at all.
Such important work. And that word management brings it back to me to that human nature relationship that you all have been working in. And also, Kimberly, I want to come back to one of your initial comments about humans as the invasive. So can you tell me what you're thinking about there and how that might have changed or affects you as an artist?
Yeah, Diana said one thing that was a threat when she was discussing those terms, and she said for invasive, it's a threat to that complexity of what's happening in that system. And I think that's exactly the approach of humans, is how we're impacting our environment and changing it. What was the second part of the question? I had to read that first.
No, that's really great, because I think this is part of your work, is this relationship between people and the landscapes and ecosystems that you've been working with has been striking you. And more in your work, I've been noticing that you are highlighting things that are not necessarily great going on, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think to take it a step further that I haven't actually done in this body of work, but it's all an evolution, is that I've started to focus more on how to work with only natural materials as well. So creating my own ink and silk screening and drawing fluid from only working with nature-based pigments. So collecting them myself, foraging, using food waste. So that's an evolution of my work that I'm currently working on now. It doesn't show up in this particular exhibit, but because of the work I've done in the past and through this exhibit, I've naturally grown into wanting to have less of a footprint in the materials that I use and purchase, essentially. Wanting to remove my footprint from that cycle.
It's great, and that begins to make that commentary about, social norms that, perhaps should be evolving, right? So cool. So Diana, does that hit you as a scientist?
Yeah, it does so much. It's funny because, I do think that as big a player humans have been in modifying landscapes all over the world, especially through development, right? We have modified landscapes so much. And I think that it's given us this impression that nature, instead of now, during colonial times, I think it was like there was this like man versus nature, and we stronger. And now I do think we see ecosystems as kind of fragile and delicate, even though when you, especially around New Hampshire, when you see sort of a decrepit house that no one's living in and you see nature taking it over, or a parking lot where early successional species are coming in and starting the process of converting that parking lot into a forest again. And so even though, there's this kind of juxtaposition of fragile landscapes that are vulnerable to human modification, and then nature kind of taking over these highly modified habitats. And I just love that juxtaposition. And I think it's really interesting to think about. But one thing that really struck me about what you're saying, Kimberly, about using pigments from nature is that in one way you're removing the footprint by using an unprocessed, a relatively unprocessed material. And then on the other hand, you're kind of like leaving a footprint, but in a good way. You're so much closer to the thing that's being represented, or the thing that you're giving a nod to, and that's inspiring you. You're actually like taking a little bit of it, and I just feel like it allows, for me, making specimens, the whole process of taking it, making sure that I choose a plant that has leaves and flowers and roots and all of those identifying features that would allow me to study it completely, and then pressing it and preserving it and mounting it just so. There are ways of not just respect, right? It's like goes beyond that. It's really cherishing these specimens. And I feel like that's true when you make pigments from mushrooms and roots and things as well. It's sort of this like big thank you and a recognition of the species that you're, you know, getting very intimate with it. You know,
it definitely brings it right back to the science. Because it's collecting, it's knowing about that species. Is it poisonous? How do I boil this? Do I smash it? Do I crush it? Can I breathe this? Is it going to be toxic? Recording its properties. How much do you pick versus do you leave in order for plant growth? So it comes back to the same principles in a way that you're using for your collections.
I really think so. And it's that acknowledgement of like, you're poisonous, you know, it's that conversation, I think, with the organisms and that like real appreciation that I think sometimes, you know, we think of ourselves as being like sort of at a deficit with exposure to nature. And I think those interactions and really, you know, with science, you know, we're always trying to quantify things so that we have this like usable information, but it all starts with these basic observations. And I think there's a real opportunity with art, though, to like render nature in a way that can to people and is appealing to people, sort of at a different way that is much more relevant. You know. Yeah.
As you're saying this, I'm thinking we never got around to making our artistic endangered species salad. If that was, or the like highly collected plant species salad that was going to end up in this show that did not, but it's there. I still want to make the salad.
Yeah, it's in my mind, definitely.
Maybe that should be a recipe that you write up and we have. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah,
I love what you guys are saying because it feels to me like we're getting to the core of this is the intentionality, the integrity of your work, the honesty, and you're taking the intellectual experience and you're bringing it close to the object, to the source, close to the environment you're in, the specifics of what you're observing. To me, that just seems, I don't know what the word is, but it's just so real and so, honest. That's one of the things that hits me.
It's honest. It definitely, you know, I think it resonates because, and maybe it does play a kind of like even a spiritual, you know, there's a spiritual element to it, that it feels good, that it feels wholesome and feels right. And, you know, we're modern humans, but modern humans evolved 200,000 years ago. And so, you know, there's still things that I think resonate with us that are little pieces of our ancient selves that, you know, had very keen senses.
I think the majority of society has lost that, and I'm eager to get back to those beginnings.
I love that. I love that. Great.
Yeah, there's that joy in collecting and sorting, storing for later, kind of like saving up your stores and like, oh, look at what I have. And then you show it to other people. See, what do you have? This is what I have. Yeah. So science and art does that, you know, in their own ways.
I love that. I love that. See what I have and sharing it. Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic.
Well, it's hard to wrap that up. That was such a great conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Let's see if we have some questions, if you'd like to have our speakers answer questions. I'm so struck again by your passion, each of your passion for this material. And it made me think about, you know, if there are special places in the world besides this particular area that have led you to this work, or moment in time, or a particular plant. I was really interested, again, just struck by your passion. So I was wondering about the genesis of that.
I can answer that. My undergrad thesis project was on a more common alpine plant, Diapensia lapponica. It's just called Diapensia. And I first learned about it in a winter ecology course, and my professor was just going on and on about it and all its specific adaptations, how it survived like these severe cold winters up in the harsh alpine zone. And it just sounded so exotic. It was nothing I had heard about before, and you don't encounter it in your daily life. So it just seemed like something from another world.
Someone asked in the chat what, and I don't know who they were asking specifically, but what the favorite undiscovered species work was. So I don't know who, if they want to speak up, who they were asking specifically, but I'll just share a little bit about that, if that's okay, really quick. So the undiscovered species work, again, was a chance for me as an artist just to be able to play around with my work without an end goal. Also, all of that work was a collaboration with artist Fawn Intencio out in Denver, Colorado. She actually mailed me some of her work and I mailed her some of mine, and we did an exchange, and this is what evolved out of that, or part of that. So it was complete freedom at that point, because a lot of the times we'll work more conceptually in my work and have an end goal, and this gave me the chance to balance my energy, if you will, with focusing on work that was more conceptual versus having freedom to play around and just simply be creative. So the pieces that I like the most out of that are the ones that are called the conceptual drawings, or the ones that are the grid, because I was just able to approach the work completely free, have no set intentions. And then what stemmed out of that was also the sculptures, the ones that are installed on the wall and the ones that are hanging. I personally love those. But it's my work, so.
I'm kind of reading I'm reading a little bit in the chat. There's some good stuff going on there, but I also contributed my favorite piece, and so did Hannah. So you could check those out there, but there's a wall called Uprooted, your piece called Uprooted, that is just profiles that you did with your class, Kimberly. And it's that use of negative space is just really stunning and kind of like makes me very anxious. But what's funny is I can look at those profiles and identify every species there. They're just sort of like empty. It's striking. I wanted to mention one thing about undiscovered species and herbaria, and it's not written in the exhibit, but a large number of species are discovered from herbarium collections every year. And that's partly because of this DNA technology that Hannah's talking about, but it's usually just because people are filing specimens and they are in a stack, say, of dandelions or something related to that, maybe even some of these alpine plants like Hannah's studying, and they'll notice one specimen that just doesn't totally look like the rest, and you just get this feeling, like Hannah described in the chat, actually, this feeling of like seeing an undiscovered species for the first time. You just get this like, I need to key that out. I need to look a little closer at that. And so as a result of this, of just filing specimens, people discover, several species a year just from preserved pressed herbarium specimens that have probably been in herbaria for decades. So that's kind of interesting.
Kimberly, we have a question. What would you recommend somebody who wants to start using natural pigments in their artworks?
So I was trying to get that in the chat, so I'm glad you brought it up. But there's a book that is a fantastic resource. There's lots of resources out there, but this one in particular, called Make Ink, A Forager's Guide to Natural Ink Making, is a fantastic resource. And we're actually, in my art and sustainability class this semester, we're making natural ink and using that to draw some of the trees on campus that are part of the Valuing Our Campus Trees tour. And some students actually use pieces of the trees to make the ink. So we studied the trees and their natural pigment making properties and use that to make ink. But you can use basic things such as food waste that you have. So boiling avocado shells and seeds will make a lovely red color. So it's just simply putting them in a pot and boiling them and reducing that water to make a very simple type of ink. And you could do that with just by crushing berries, even blueberries or strawberries. So basic things that you actually have around your house that you perhaps even use as food waste. Turmeric makes a really good ink that's easy and usually found in the kitchen. But I'll share that link in the chat as well.
Great.
That's a very short answer for a very long-winded, what could be a long-winded question, answer.
Cool. Thank you. We have another question. I'm interested to hear why each of you became interested in your particular area of work. Was this present when you were young, discovered in your teens, later? Hannah, do you want to answer that first?
Sure. Well, I grew up in the White Mountains, so I'm pretty familiar with the environments here, and hiking in the woods and up the mountains. I mean, everything is just a mountain. You have to go uphill and downhill all the time. But alpine areas in particular, I became interested in with this Diapensia project as an undergrad. I was just interested in different mountaintops having the same assemblage of plants that only grow on the very tops of those mountains. Like, how do they mix with each other? Do they mix? Do pollinators move from one mountaintop to another? Like thinking about between Katahdin and the Adirondacks, do those plants have anything in common anymore? Do they have any connection with each other? So that's what I was sort of getting at with my undergrad project. And wanting to sort of continue that because I wasn't really satisfied with how that project ended. And so I was thinking for my graduate research, like what plants can I focus on? I wanted to focus on some rare plants because I did a fellowship after I graduated college with the New England Wildflower Society, or it's called Native Plant Trust now. And in the conservation department, we got to learn about where all of these rare plants were in all of New England. And sometimes they were just surprising, like, oh, what is this odd plant doing in this odd place? And so you could see this bigger picture of where they all are, but they're all very separate from each other in the same way they were on the mountaintops. So coming into my grad research, I was thinking about how I wanted to focus on rare plants and alpine plants. But which one did I want to focus on? And at first I overlooked dwarf cinquefoil because it's been so managed in the past. It's like, it's a very beloved plant. It's a success story for the Endangered Species Act. It has all this press already. It just seemed like too famous, like so too many people knew about it. So what was there left to know? But then I came to discover that no one had looked at the genetics of this plant yet, which was very surprising for how studied it's been. So that's how I landed on that project.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. Diana, do you want to talk maybe about how you got started in your research?
Sure. So, yeah, Bridget asked, were you young? I always hate saying that I discovered botany and research when I was young because it makes it sound like it's exclusive. I really think you can come, studying natural history can be something that just comes to you at some time during your development. And for me, it happened to be in my late teen years. But I also grew up in New Hampshire, in the southeastern part of the state. And so it's really, since we're in a water, we're not in a water limited area. And so there's plants everywhere. And it's very clear that plants are sort of these ecosystem engineers. They drive lots of ecological processes happening in the state. And so plants were just like a very big presence in my life. But late in high school, I got interested in studying plants in some way very seriously, and moved out to the Pacific Northwest for college. And while I was visiting colleges, of course, I visited Humboldt County and the Redwood Forests, and that's all it took. I was done, like it was going to be botany for the rest of my life. So if you get a chance to be around big trees, and that can be relative, so whatever you think is big, but once you're standing under these redwoods, like you just have this feeling that's like, I don't know, truth. So then I focused a lot on the plants in those forests, including these plants that are called mycoheterotrophs that I'm sure all of you who live here are familiar with. Indian pipes, or ghost plant, is a plant that grows here. And I studied some relatives of those out west. They parasitize fungi and get all their carbon nutrition from those plants. So I kind of became obsessed with that group of plants and just wanted to understand how they evolved. When I discovered plant taxonomy, which is the identification of plants that allows you to discover new species, I was probably in my junior year of college, and an emeritus professor was mounting his backlog from like his career in botany, and I got to do that for work study, and I just realized, oh my gosh, I'm in heaven. So then that was it. I just studied taxonomy from there on out, and so that's how I got started. But I have colleagues in California who had entire careers as electricians, astrophysicists, who are some of the best botanists. We call them amateur botanists, but they're incredible and they make great contributions to science, and botany is like their second, it's like their hobby after they retire. So you can really start at any time learning this like immense amount of detail and evolutionary relationships among plants. It's gratifying for some. So
that's so cool. Thanks, Diana.
Yeah.
Kimberly, how did you get started?
I love this question, and I love reflecting back on it. And the same as Diana, part of my puzzle was moving out west, which I'll get there in just a second. But my parents are here, and they've never had the opportunity to hear me say this before. And I didn't put all these pieces together really until I was in graduate school writing my thesis. But it definitely started as growing up on a farm in rural North Carolina, and my father being a scientist, and we didn't really watch television. We were just told to go outside and play and on the farm. And I didn't realize what that life was like until I left that life, and reflecting on that, that has made me who I am. It's also what I hope provide for my own child, but that connection with nature that was instilled with me from a very young age. And then I went to undergraduate school at Appalachian State University. So in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, that low geographically, very much like where we live here in New Hampshire. And my eyes were open to that environment, which was different from where I grew up, and more of a environmentally conscious group of people. And then when I was an undergrad one summer, I had an art course where we explored the land art movement out west. And there was 10 of us and 2 professors in a smelly van for a month that traveled around all the Southwest states and saw so much, both historical, native, and land art. And that was what sent me to moving out west. One of the pieces that sent me to moving out west. The other one was my now husband, who was living in Colorado at the time. And that's how I ended up in Colorado, and that's where I went to graduate school. And being in Colorado, again, that mindset of more of environmentally conscious type of people in the environment that I was in. And that's when I really started to put all the pieces together about working more towards environmental artwork. And I'm still developing it. Like I said in the presentation, I'm still moving forward with how to work with my passions about the environment in different ways. And now it's moving on to how do I reduce my footprint with my materials.
All right. It looks like we are kind of all caught up with questions. Lots of appreciation in the chat.
Wow, I just want to thank you all. This has been really wonderful. What a really interesting conversation, and great to hear. I love the chat going on. In fact, it's kind of weird to have you be talking on one thing and then you're also typing and having a whole nother conversation at the same time. This Zoom stuff is craziness, but it really is, to me, it's been a really rich conversation this evening. I want to thank you, Kimberly and Hannah and Diana, for being here. and for putting together such an amazing exhibit. And I hope you all of you who are able to be visiting the museum and seeing this show live, if you're a Plymouth State student, faculty, or staff, you can swipe in and get in. If you're not, we hope that you will visit the online exhibition. For now, we're going to keep the exhibit up through February. So that's the good news, is we get to live with it for a while longer. So thank you all so very much for coming this evening.